Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you have ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. I am your host, Patty Porter. My guest hosts, Zena Zumeta and Stephen Kotev, along with our guest experts, will share our experiences, raise your awareness, and give you food for thought. We will share with you problem-solving strategies no matter what your situation is. At work, with neighbors or friends, family, and with partners. Tune in or join in the conversation every Tuesday evening.
Hello, everyone. This is Zena Zumeta, and I am your guest host. The program today is Beyond Intractability. The Conflict Information Consortium has a primary focus on complex, society-wide, intractable conflicts. It has pioneered efforts to use the information technologies to provide people from all walks of life with the information that they need in order to deal with these incredibly difficult conflicts more constructively. The consortium sees such efforts to enhance and mobilize the skills of the general population as critical to efforts to deal with these complex society-wide conflicts. Joining me is Guy Burgess. Guy and Heidi Burgess both earned their Ph.D.s in sociology from the University of Colorado in 1979. They then did postdoctoral work at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and worked for several years as public policy conflict consultants. In 1988, with support from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, they established, along with others, the University of Colorado Conflict Research Consortium, now called the Conflict Information Consortium, which they have co-directed ever since. It is my great pleasure to have Guy Burgess here. He and Heidi are my heroes, so welcome to the program, Guy.
Well, good to be here. Appreciate the invitation and look forward to chatting.
Definitely. So could you start out just talking a little bit about the goals of Beyond Intractability?
Where we stand at the moment is really, I think, broader than our particular program. Years ago, when I was just out of graduate school, I had the luck of working with another Boulder outfit, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, at a time when they were just starting to catch on to this notion of global warming and climate change. And as luck would have it, I was working on a different project, but I happened to be in the same office and listened to folks sort of going through these agonizing discussions. I mean, there were a bunch of climate change experts. They went to scientific conferences, and it sort of caught on to this thing that the whole world needed to not only know about, but they needed to really do something about. And, sort of coming out of those conversations and work in lots of other places, you had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they actually won, and I think deservedly so, a Nobel Peace Prize for raising public attention to the climate change issue. And the way I see it is conflict is in sort of the same place. If we start looking ahead a couple of decades and ask ourselves, what is the world going to be like if we don't get a whole lot better at dealing with the really difficult and intractable conflicts? What's the future look like? And it doesn't look very bright. And so what we're trying to do with the sort of latest incarnation of the Beyond Intractability project is really raise awareness of the field and promote a much more broadly based effort to advance the frontier and really get the kind of support that these efforts, I think, really require, and which really isn't forthcoming. And folks right now are really good at spending lots of money fighting the same old destructive conflict games, but not much on how to change the game.
Well, and I almost have thought that we as human beings are maybe programmed to have this kind of generational intractable conflict. So the idea that somebody is looking at ways to get beyond it is, to me, as I said, heroic. It's just beyond imagination to me that you could deal with it.
Well, part of it is to think about how. And, a lot of folks think that the conflict field is basically pushing this utopian kumbaya world where there's complete justice and everybody's happy with everybody else. And the truth is that's not very realistic, and it might even actually be a pretty dull place. But what I think does make sense is a world in which we sharply limit destructive conflict, the kind that can lead to violence, can lead to really stupid decisions that don't even achieve their intended objectives, and gross unfairness and injustice. So part of the way we've been phrasing it lately is what we're trying to do is to promote the invisible hand of constructive conflict. And here we're taking Adam Smith's notion and applying it to society more generally, not just the economic sphere. And I think the real problem is what you might call the invisible fist of destructive conflict. And I think really what we're looking for is to understand the many different punches, to push a metaphor maybe a bit too far, that the invisible fist can throw and how to defend against them.
Well, so can you describe, just as we get started on this conversation, what you mean by intractable? I know I have an image in my mind, but when you talk about it, what do you define as intractable conflict?
Well, there's a couple of ways to come at this. We make a very, I think, important distinction between conflict and dispute, where the conflicts tend to be intractable. They tend to be long-running tensions between different religious beliefs, between distributional conflicts over who gets what, different questions over who's going to have what position within society as far as status is concerned, all these kinds of things. Conflicts between environmentalists and businesses, conflicts between different racial and ethnic groups. And these conflicts are composed of a pretty much innumerable series of dispute episodes. And some of these disputes are resolved in the courts. Some of them are resolved with elections. Some of them are resolved with litigation. Some of them are resolved with stalemate, and you get the default business as usual option, whether you want it or not. Occasionally, they're resolved with negotiation and a mutually beneficial agreement. A lot more could be resolved that way, but somehow we haven't quite managed to overcome the obstacles to that. So in one sense, intractability is the long-running conflicts of which all the disputes are composed. In another sense, they're conflicts over moral issues and different definitions of right and wrong that are deeply held, and people are not really going to change their mind anytime soon. Individuals might, but there will always be folks on both sides of the abortion debate, for example. So you'll have continuing intractability on that. You'll have continuing intractable tensions between different identity groups. So that's one set of definitions. Another is a little different, that focuses on these destructive conflict dynamics that wind up producing unwise and unfair decisions, and also that tend to concentrate. Still yet another way to look at this is the tension between a conflict system where disputes are resolved using a power over strategy. That is, somebody has power over everybody else. And that's the world that I don't want to live in much. And what we're trying to promote as an alternative, and this, in a sense, is the invisible hand, are power with solutions. So we're looking for ways in which we can govern society together in ways that benefit everyone.
Well, are you talking about the kinds of conflicts? For example, I think of the Middle East or Eastern Europe, or are you thinking of conflicts? We recently had some conflicts near St. Louis with racial issues. I mean, are you thinking of the ones that I think of as go generations, or are you thinking more of the business disputes or the water disputes or the more situational?
What I'm most worried about are the large-scale conflicts that can become unbelievably destructive. What's happened in Syria and Iraq with ISIS is sort of the ultimate nightmare of how conflict can go completely out of control and become completely destructive. I'm very much worried about the worsening tensions along the political divide in the United States. We like to think that these terrible things that happen in other countries could never happen here. But there's a lot of reason to be worried. I mean, we have a society that, by a lot of measures, is relatively violent. We incarcerate something like 6 times, rather, we send people to jail at something like 6 times the rate of the next closest country. We have enormously deep differences between the very, very wealthy and everyone else. The hostility level between the political left and the political right seems to be intensifying. I was talking about, actually, in class today, a new study that uses the same techniques that are designed to measure racial prejudice, and they're using them to measure political prejudice. And it turns out that we are prejudiced against the other political party in a way that used to characterize severe racial prejudice. It's almost to the point now where it's a bigger taboo for a Democrat to marry a Republican as it used to be for a white person to marry an African American. And that's frankly worrying. We can't let things slide that bad.
You're almost talking about situations where we dehumanize other people, that we don't even see them as people anymore.
And, it's maybe not to the point of where you see with ISIS where chopping people up's okay, but the level of scorn with which we speak of people who have deeply held beliefs on the other side of the political divide is troubling. And it's something I think we need to step back from. And folks on the left and the right both do it. And this is not something that's, just the other party's the source of all evil here.
Yeah, that is very scary. I think you're exactly right. So what is it that you think can be done, or what is it that you're suggesting be done in these situations?
Well, the way we see it, and we've been struggling with this a lot, and I've got actually a lecture that I give to my students about the evolution of the field and how we started out just as an anti-war movement. We were against war, and that was that. And we figured out we really needed to understand what causes war and what to do about it. Then we went through a period where we thought that getting to yes and interest-based bargaining could resolve everything. And then we came to grips with the fact, well, that doesn't work in these truly intractable situations. It has real difficulty when you're dealing with Machiavellian actors. So we started thinking about, well, how do you deal with these tough cases? And then realized that you're not talking about just disputes between folks who can sit around a table, but you're talking about disputes that characterize societies that have millions of people and countless hundreds of millions of interactions. So the scale problem is enormously difficult. So then you start running into, Boutros Ghali came up with this concept of peace building, which is how you get past not just an end of violence, which is what peacemaking is, and peacekeeping with peacekeeping forces to prevent the resurgence of violence. But peace building is the
He was with the UN, right? You're talking about the
That's right. He was Secretary General, and this was in the agenda of peace. But peace building involves the transformation of entire societies. And that's what we've been trying to learn how to do. And we tried actually in Iraq and Afghanistan after some rather terrible initial mistakes. There were a lot of people who tried very, very hard to make right what we initially did very wrong there in terms of transforming these societies. And it's not working very well.
Right. That's what I was thinking is if that was peace building, it sure didn't work.
Right. So now I think the frontier of the field has to do with complexity. And how do you deal with conflict problems on this scale? And we make a distinction between complicated and complex approaches. And complicated approaches sort of imagine a command and control system. And if somebody comes up with a plan and the president gives the order, everybody will follow the plan and everything will work out swimmingly. The problem is people don't like to take orders, and that you're really dealing with something that's closer to a herding cats problem, where you've got a whole lot of independently minded folks doing their own thing for their own reasons based on imperfect information and imperfect decision rules. And how do you improve that? And that's sort of the focus of complexity. And
before you get into complexity, let me just mention that you are listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program, and we are talking about Beyond Intractability with Heidi Burgess. So continue on with complexity.
Yeah, well, the way that we try to, and we've been futzing with this for a long time, trying to figure out something that really makes sense. And the approach that I think is most promising is built on what you might call the medical model of problem solving. And here you need to make a distinction between two ways of solving problems. There's the engineering model, and we're a society of gadgeteers, and we tend to think in terms of engineering solutions. In fact, the whole phrase peace building implies that somebody somewhere's got a plan and he's just building it. And the problem is, as I say, nobody takes orders very well, so that just doesn't work. Now, doctors have figured out another way of dealing with systems, and they deal with what we call complex systems, which were not designed, but they evolved. And so nobody's got the plans. Nobody has control of the whole system. Nobody's got the plans for your body, and there's no this place that you can control everything. So what doctors do is they look for pathologies, diseases, things that can go wrong, try to understand those, and devise treatments. And as medicine has advanced over the years, we have a bigger and bigger list of diseases that we can deal with. Sometimes they can provide complete cures. Sometimes they can provide just symptomatic relief with hay fever and Claritin. Sometimes the best they can do is teach you how to live with something. That's what the Americans with Disabilities Act is about. And sometimes they really can't do anything, and that's what hospice care is about. And the same is true for conflict. There are some conflict problems, misunderstandings, that we're really very good at solving. We can fix those. There are some things that are sort of chronic and you have to live with. A lot of these conflicts, sibling rivalry comes to mind. But we can make that a lot better. There are some things that you've got to sort of learn to live with, but you can live in a lot less destructive ways. And then there are some things that we don't have solutions for, which is Syria. But if you can, a lot of the conflicts, and this goes back to this invisible hand, invisible fist thing. Now, the invisible hand are conflicts that persist over the long term, but they're relatively constructive, and we actually learn from them, rather than conflicts that get out of hand and the destructive elements of them sort of overwhelm everything.
Well, so I'm clear on the destructive ones, but what do you mean by the ones that we can live with, or the ones that seem constructive? What kinds of things are you thinking of there?
Well, the key thing is to focus on particular problems and what can be done to deal with them. So, and one of the things that we're trying to develop is that has sort of a parallel in medicine, where it's kind of a physician's desk reference, which has got all the list of all the diseases you can get, is to have something of a list of all of the conflict problems you can have. So, for instance, one problem is something we call the Posterity Trap. And it comes from Groucho Marx, who famously asked, "What's posterity ever done for me anyway?" And the truth is that future generations aren't here to have a seat at the table to have their interests represented. And in case after case after case, near-term conflicts and disputes are being resolved by passing the bill off on future generations. We couldn't decide who to pay for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, so we let future generations get the bill. We can't decide who should pay for infrastructure repair, so we just let it rot and figure the future generations will have to rebuild it sometime. Climate change, and the list goes on. So what we need are institutions that give future generations a seat at the table. And
how do you do that?
Well, society has some precedents for this, that they're sort of statutory. Take the Land Grant Act. One of the things that we felt very strongly about in the early days of the United States was that there ought to be free public education. So when we were settling the Great American West, which we had acquired by altogether not honorable means from Native Americans, but that's a different story, we divided the West up into 36 square mile sections. And 2 square miles in every section were given to the schools as a source of income in perpetuity to fund public education.
Wow.
So it's things like that. I mean, that's what the Clean Air Act is supposed to do. That's what the Clean Water Act does. That they're statutory. We recognize the wisdom of preparing for things over the long term.
That seems like it's kind of unusual for us human beings to do.
We're not very good at it. And my son's been very active in trying to find constructive ways of addressing climate change. And, what you're talking about here are different manifestations of what's called the tragedy of the commons. That if you allow individuals to pursue their own self-interest without regard to their effects on common resources, then eventually the commons will collapse and then everybody loses. But in case after case, we're not protecting the commons, whether it's climate change, whether it's spending the money that's needed to deal with potential infectious disease outbreaks. Ebola comes to mind, but there are lots of others. We could have dealt with Ebola early in this for a teeny-weeny fraction of what we're going to have to spend now, not to mention the human costs of allowing this epidemic to get out of control. So we're not dealing the education. There's a recent OECD report about how U.S. education stands up to international standards. They make the claim, which I have no reason to doubt, that this may be the first generation in the history of the United States where young people have less education than their parents.
Wow.
And it's because we're not investing in schools and education and all of that. And we've made education so unaffordable that the college loans that students can never, ever, ever get out of are so overwhelming, they're going to burden their ability to be consumers and contribute to the economy for decades. And
So now that you have me completely depressed, what is it that people can do?
Well, and I have a slide that I use that has a bunch of superheroes with a big, red circle with a cross through it saying, "You don't expect superhero solutions. This is a do-it-ourselves problem. The only way in which we stand a chance is not waiting for somebody to fix it. The Obama who really delivers and lived up to his initial expectations or something. But it requires, painstaking work by everybody in pretty much every walk of life. One of the metaphors I like to use is based on Google traffic. And you should think of the conflict system a bit like Google Maps. And you turn Google traffic on, and it'll tell you where all the traffic jams are. And then it'll put in little red diamonds where there are problems, whether it's construction or an accident or something. And what we all need to do is to look at the conflicts around us, identify where there are problems, and then adopt part of the highway and say, I'm going to take responsibility for fixing that. If you've got two groups that aren't coming together and don't understand each other, say, I'm going to convene them and we're going to get them to understand each other. And it's a lot of small-scale things like that. And it requires teaching a lot of people a lot of very different conflict skills for use depending on their particular situation, their role in society. But there's always something that pretty much anybody can do.
So really what you're suggesting is that conflict education not just look at the small conflicts, the school conflicts, the work conflicts, but that we can use a lot of those same ideas to begin to think of ourselves as responsible for the big things and not just the small things.
That's right.
Wow. That's revolutionary.
Yeah. It's a simple idea, but it goes back to this notion of complexity, and where the course of a society is determined by the cumulative decisions of the people who live there. It's not determined by some puppet master somewhere who's calling the shots. And there isn't somebody in control, but there is a problem with, you might call it the 1% of the 1% problem, that there are folks who have far too much power in our society. I think that they are solidifying and expanding that power using a divide and conquer strategy that tries deliberately to exacerbate the conflicts between various communities and to divide ourselves into these warring political factions and prevent us from coming together and say, we all have an interest in letting people get ahead who work hard, but there's a difference between the 1% and the 99% problem, and then the 1% of the 1% where you get into predatory capitalists and the guys who are doing things that by any reasonable standard should be criminal, or you get into Machiavellian politicians that are doing things that if anybody really knew what they were doing, folks would be aghast.
So what's interesting to me, among many other things, about what you're saying is that the solutions that you're suggesting are both very liberal and deeply conservative at the same time. Yeah.
I think there's a lot that can be learned from both traditions. And there are all sorts of reasons to believe, in fact, there are even some sort of surprising studies that indicate there may even be some genetic differences between liberals and conservatives, where liberals tend to be a little more risk-taking and a little more reckless, And conservatives tend to be more respectful of tradition and past insights and a little less likely to want to keep changing things. And there's a strength in balancing that.
Yes, yeah. And yet the kind of responsibility that you're suggesting people take, I think, appeals to both.
Yeah. Well, I what I'd like to see is folks start to recognize that and start getting out of this sort of partisan trap that we have ourselves, but not to think that there's grand solutions, but to leave a place for everybody. If you start parsing the language with which people talk about contemporary conflict in the United States, it's too much predicated on, well, if this and this happens, we can finally defeat those guys.
Right.
And it's not talking, Democrats talk about, oh, well, the demographic trends on our side. If we can hold out for 8 years, the Republicans will have had it. And, I mean, even if that's true, we need to learn how to live together.
Yes, we do. Well, as you know, we like it at the end of each program to suggest to people things that they can do. So is there anything that you might suggest for an individual who would like to start to deal with some of these complex problems? Where should they start? What should somebody do?
Well, what we've been trying to do for years, and we're in the process of trying to massively upgrade this, and is to structure our Beyond Intractability and our CR Info projects as collaborative learning communities. So it isn't just us publishing and distributing what we've learned. I think our systems now have been written collectively by maybe 500 contributors or something.
Wow.
But what we'd like to do is make it much broader than that. And there are an awful lot of great ideas that are out there, people who have done surprising and inspirational things. And there's great material on the web, whether it's a TED Talk, whether it's interesting discussions or books or articles or whatever, that's getting lost in the sea of destructive conflict as usual information. So part of what we see as the solution is to really kind of facilitate a collaborative learning community that shares ideas on more constructive approaches and makes them more visible in the context of an information environment that's dominated by destructive conflict information. So there's places on our website, for instance, where you can click the contact button that sends us an immediate email. It just avoids spam a bit. And we're looking for people to send us links to stories about people who are doing important stuff to make the world a little bit better. And that we want to do is to start trying to make that information more readily available, to organize it in a way where it's a little easier to find. What we're going to be doing fairly soon is integrating all of this with the big social networks of Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and even the Peace and Collaborative Development Network.
Wonderful.
Which I think gives us an ability to collaborate on a large scale that just didn't used to exist. And in an environment where so much of the media is dominated by folks who frame things and in a sense are in the business of selling this intractable conflict. And conflict sells, people getting along doesn't. So you tend to have the media that makes everything seem a lot worse than it really is. And that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So you're really looking for people's good ideas and good news and reports of what's going on that is helping.
That's right. And
that's
hopefully
wonderful.
as we start to get this a little more together, that we can share that on our networks and invite folks to share what we find on their networks. It's not like it all gets centered around our stuff, but this goes back to this complexity notion that it's a multi-centric thing, and you want to get lots of different people with different networks, different circles of people who trust one another, to distribute good ideas, but a different collection of good ideas in each case.
That's great. Well, I'm wondering if you have a final message that you want to leave with our listeners?
I think the message is that we all have a responsibility to find some way to make a difference, and that we really shouldn't keep being spectators.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us. I know that you've collected so much information, and you keep on doing that. That's really available to the public on your CR Info website, but also you have your beyondintractability.org website as well, and that on that website, if people want to email Guy or Heidi Burgess, that there is a contact form right on that website. So thank you so much, and it's just been wonderful talking with you.
Great. We'll enjoy it. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you enjoyed the program. You can find all of our podcasts archived to listen at your convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. You can also become a Facebook fan of Conflict Connection or Twitter me at TXConflictCoach.